The second speaker of this panel is a talent of our own. He's a professor of social science of College of Arts and Sciences, Dr. Gail Linsenbard, who received a PhD in philosophy, yes, at the University of Colorado in the year 1997. I have to really wear my glasses. Prior to joining New York Institute of Technology, she was on the faculty of New York University and the University of Colorado. Her most recent book, Starting with Sartre, explores Sartre's most influential philosophical predecessors. So let's welcome Dr. Gail Linsenbard.
Okay, so the title of my paper is Possibilities of Statecraft Without Democracy, ? So I begin with a little history. In a well-known passage from his classical political treatise, Leviathan, the 17th century philosopher Thomas Hobbes imagines what life would be like in the absence of political authority, a hypothetical condition known as the state of nature. In such a state, he says, there would be a war of all against all, with no knowledge of the face of the earth, no account of time, no arts, no letters, no society, and, which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death. And the life of man, he says, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. It is no wonder Hobbes offered such a dramatic account of the state of nature. Having been born, he says, a twin of fear, and having witnessed firsthand the calamities of the English Civil War, Hobbes was keen to warn us of the dangers of wholesale civil breakdown in the absence of government. On the basis of his ominous deductions, he was, after all, very much influenced by Euclid's geometry. Hobbes justifies a nearly absolute form of government with virtually no checks or balances on that, quote, immortal God, as he calls it, that is the sovereign power or king, who shall both keep the peace and keep his subjects in awe. Nearly 300 years later, reflecting on the shattering aftermath of World War I, the American philosopher John Dewey, also philosopher of education and pragmatist, was inspired by another vision of keeping the peace, one decidedly different from Hobbes's way of thinking. Dewey saw inclusive pluralism as opposed to unchecked authoritarianism as the proper political model. Quote, as the work of integration and consolidation reaches its climax, the question arises whether the national state is not just an instrumentality for promoting and protecting other and more voluntary forms of association, rather than a supreme end in itself. Dewey offers two facts to support an affirmative reply of the diminished state power. First, he says, along with the development of the larger, more inclusive, and more unified organization of the state has gone the emancipation of individuals from restrictions and servitudes previously imposed on them by custom and class status. Compulsory associations have been replaced by voluntary ones, rigid organizations by those more amenable to human choice and purposes. As they develop in number and importance, the state tends to become more and more a regulator and adjuster among them, defining the limits of their actions and preventing and settling conflicts. Dewey argues that the newfound association of persons challenges the supremacy of the state as an end in itself, and offers a metaphor of the state as the conductor of an orchestra who makes no music himself but harmonizes the activities of those who are engaged cooperatively on worthwhile pursuits. While the state remains highly important, Dewey notes, its importance is attenuated, consisting solely in the power to foster and coordinate the activities of voluntary groupings. For Dewey, every combination of human forces that adds its own contribution of value to life has for that reason its own unique and ultimate worth, and cannot be degraded into a means to glorify the state. In point of fact, he says, war becomes increasingly demoralizing because it forces the state into an abnormally supreme position. The second fact Dewey offers to support an attenuated view of the state is the opposition between the claim of independent sovereignty in behalf of territorial national states, the territorial national state, and the growth of transnational interests. Here, anticipating the emerging realities of 21st century globalization, Dewey is remarkably prescient. The weal and woe of any modern state, he says, is bound up with that of others. Weakness, disorder, false principles on the part of any state are not confined within its boundaries. The same is true of economic, artistic, and scientific advances. Hence, Dewey observes, our internationalism is not an aspiration, but a fact, not a sentimental ideal, but a force. I consider the theme of this conference the challenges of democratization in the Middle East, U.S., Turkey, and the Arab world against the backdrop of these two starkly opposed visions of statecraft. To be sure, Hobbes's fears seem very real in the context of our world today. The protracted violence and breakdown in Syria following civil uprisings with the deepening humanitarian crisis pushing well beyond Syria's borders have devolved into a kind of Hobbesian state of nature with no end in sight. Syria's uprisings, fueled by the 2010 Arab Spring, have been brutally beaten back by its president, Bashar al-Assad. Although the West was and continues to be sanguine about the prospects for democracy in the Middle East, one might ask whether, given the repressive regional pushback on the heels of the Arab Spring and the increasing political diversity in the world today, we might be better off in a world that forges statecraft outside of the shadows of Western-style liberal democracy. We might push Dewey's insight into the stark realities of the 21st century and view the global order as a multipolar symphony or orchestra whose conductor makes no music but harmonizes the whole. As Karl Kupchan remarks in his excellent book, No One's World, with few exceptions, notably Egypt, most of the states in the Middle East are political constructions left behind by retreating colonial powers. Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and much of the Arabian Peninsula and North Africa present a patchwork of tribal, sectarian, and ethnic identities, and hence also divisions that often trump national identity. Since these fissures have, for the most part, been suppressed by coercive rule, it might be asked whether democratization would do more to accentuate them rather than repair them. A new global order that is inclusive and pluralistically oriented will seek to harmonize these cleavages rather than repress or dismiss them, as it forges a global rule of law and governance. It will hold all political actors accountable for not only sustaining but promoting a flourishing humanity in the 21st century and beyond. Moreover, as Kupchan remarks, the spread of participatory politics in the Middle East has strengthened rather than weakened the political sway of religious parties, signaling a deepening departure from the West. To be sure, the Arab Spring's popular uprisings seem to reflect universal longing for the values of human dignity, autonomy, and opportunity, but importantly, these longings do not necessarily also reflect a universal embrace of the Western worldview. We need only think about real regional examples to appreciate the force of this observation. Following the US-led invasion in 2003, Islamic forces have turned out to be one of the main beneficiaries of Iraq's truncated democracy. Following the 2006 elections, Palestinians voted for the militant Islamist party Hamas that later seized control of the Gaza Strip, and elections in Lebanon enhanced the influence of the Islamic fundamentalist group Hezbollah. Thus, the Arab Spring could have similar impact elsewhere, strengthening Islamist forces in countries whose regimes have been toppled by popular uprisings. As these examples illustrate, democratization does not necessarily equal westernization. Hence, as Kupchan observes, the more democratic the Middle East becomes, the greater the role that Islam, even if a moderate brand, will play in public life. This outcome would be neither good nor bad. It would simply be a reality in the part of the world where politics and religion are inextricably intertwined. Thus, while the West yearns for hegemonic influence of its most cherished ideals, particularly with respect to exporting the ideal of Western democracy, it may very well confront intractable difficulties. And here I quote from Kupchan from his book. In the Middle East, more democracy may well mean more political Islam and the emergence of Arab states which, precisely because they are representative, will be less willing to cooperate with the West rather than their autocratic predecessors. In most of the countries that have held democratic elections of one sort or another, Iran, Algeria, the Palestinian territories, Lebanon, Iraq, Islam has only strengthened its hold on politics. It is, he says, illusory for the West to think that the spread of democracy also means the spread of Western values. Moreover, the longing for human dignity and autonomy demonstrated in popular uprisings valorizing democracy is also likely to fuel a strident call to stand up to the United States, Europe, and Israel. Paradoxically, then, one of the deepest challenges to democratization in the Middle East is to recognize legitimate forms of democratic practices that are decidedly different from the Western style of liberal democracy, as well as other forms of statecraft that depart completely from democratic practice. Notably, foreign policy commentator and historian Robert Kagan has observed that elites in the West have, quote, operated on the ideological conviction that liberal democracy is the only legitimate form of government and that other forms of government are not only illegitimate, but transitory. But is liberal democracy the only legitimate form of government? Surely other non-democratic global actors, to wit, the UN, the World Bank, the IMF, the G20, help define our geopolitical institutions. No one could sensibly argue that they are not therefore legitimate. Not only is the question of liberal democracy with legitimacy arrogant, but it is also dangerous because it undermines the West's ability to cooperate with emerging powers. One stark example of this kind of dangerous rhetoric equating legitimacy with democracy is George W. Bush's remarks in his second inaugural address, quote, "America's vital interests and our deepest beliefs are now one, so it is the policy of the United States to seek and support the growth of democratic movements and institutions in every nation and culture." And more recently, President Obama and the EU's foreign policy chief, Catherine Ashton, in various speeches have signaled unwavering commitment to democracy promotion. If we are to avoid descending into a Hobbesian state of a war of all against all, the geopolitical trajectory of the 21st century might do well to follow Dewey's lead and emphasize inclusivity, pluralism, and multipolar cooperation rather than spreading or promoting liberal democracy. In this regard, Kupchan notes, only if the West works cooperatively with all regimes willing to reciprocate, democracies and non-democracies alike, will it be able to build enduring peace. Indeed, the global challenges of climate change, terrorism, food and water security, energy, health policy, and cybersecurity require nothing less than the combined, collective, and concerted efforts of all political actors if we wish to secure the world for future generations. Where does Turkey fit in? As a country at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, and as a democratic, secular, unitary, constitutional republic, Turkey's importance cannot be underemphasized. In fact, it's quite a trendsetter. Turkey is uniquely poised to be an exemplar of statecraft that can help shape the thinking and discourse of its regional neighbors in ways perhaps not anticipated by the West. Two shifting realities on the Turkish geopolitical landscape are notable. First, Turkey has shifted its orientation away from the US and Europe, moving toward a deeper engagement with its Muslim neighbors. And second, Turkey's rising middle class and expanding economy have tended to weaken secularization in politics. The rigid national secularism modeled on the West and enforced by Turkey's first president, Kemal Ataturk, has recently been challenged. The 2002 elections brought to power the Justice and Development Party, the AKP, under the leadership of Prime Minister Erdogan, and recent elections confirmed that the AKP, a party with Islamist roots, remains in power. Just last month, in his efforts to thwart allegations of corruption, Erdogan banned the social media sites YouTube and Twitter, albeit to negligible effect, and later ignored the Turkish court's ruling that such bans contravene the constitution. These events demonstrate the diminished influence of both the Turkish military and courts since the rise of the AKP. As Kupchan notes, the shift in Turkish politics has stemmed in large part from the economic and political empowerment that was formerly the country's urban and rural working class. More conservative and religious than the traditional urban elite, this rising sector of the Turkish population is the AKP's electoral base and the primary backer of the Islamist bent. Moreover, this geopolitical shift can be seen as a sea change in the Middle East and not merely incidental to Turkey. For example, the historian Oliver Roy notes that conservative in faith and beliefs, but modern in terms of business, the middle class of Islamic Puritans with a Weberian work ethic can be seen to be emerging. This neo-bourgeois adheres to traditional values and is eager to perpetuate them in the modern environment. This supports Kupchan's observation that Turkey's economic and political trajectory is diverging quite starkly from the Western model, bringing religion back into politics, not ensuring the separation of mosque and state, so that what likely lies ahead is an Islamic brand of modernity, not the secularization of Islam. Notably, Kofi Annan, the former UN Secretary General, has strenuously supported the collective responsibility to protect as the new global norm, stipulating both the requirement and moral obligation to intervene and alleviate widespread human suffering. Beyond isolation and sanctions, other proposals justifying the abrogation of state sovereignty might include international military intervention to disarm states producing weapons of mass destruction or removing those responsible for the systematic abuse and exploitation of its citizens. The norm for confronting the challenges in the 21st century will require that we promote the standard of responsible governance for all regimes, whether democratic or not. Those regimes that fall below the standard will face repercussions by the consensus of the global community's moral and legal mandate to respond. But there are no guarantees. Our collective security will depend upon our willingness to acknowledge that different kinds of polities can practice different forms of responsible governance. In contrast, as Kupchan notes, to compel other societies to embrace a certain form of government would be to impose a type of unfreedom. I return by way of conclusion to Dewey's metaphor of the state as conductor and harmonizer. Extending the metaphor, I imagine that today's global stage would host Gustav Mahler as the conductor and his symphony, The Song of the Earth. The zeitgeist of Mahler's age and music hold profound lessons for our present geopolitical situation. Mahler's romantic ethos of aspiring toward the unity of universality and individuality is expressed in much of his music in the attempt to poetically reconcile the contradictions between the ideal and the reality, while showing the challenges and difficulties that ensue are themselves part of the collective human experience. Thank you very much for listening.